Welcome to Chosen People Answers, where we strive to seek truth, find God, and know Messiah. Today we have the privilege of interviewing our colleague and host, Dr. Brian Crawford, on his new book, The Scandal of the Divine Messiah, a response to Maimonidean and Kabbalistic challenges to the Incarnation. And we'll have the link to the book in the description below. So welcome, Brian.
Thanks so much, guys. Great to talk with you about this book, which has been long time in coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your hard work in writing it. It was a joy to be part of the pre-reading process and giving some feedback, and I really learned a lot reading it. And I think a great place to start to discuss this book is asking why. Why did you write this book? Kind of what's the backstory of what motivated this whole project?
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy idea still to me that I, as this Gentile Christian, was writing a book about Orthodox Jewish positions about the deity of Jesus and how there are significant worldview issues that keep many Jewish people from believing that he can be God. Why me? I thought I was going to be an engineer for the rest of my life. And here I am doing this heavy-duty book on philosophy and theology and medieval Jewish thought. But yeah, it really came about because I was living in Brooklyn and I was talking with Orthodox Jewish people, and I had been trained in how to respond to a lot of different kinds of Jewish objections to believing in Jesus, but they kept hitting me with things that I was just totally unprepared to answer. I didn't know how to deal with so many of their objections to believing that a man could be God. And I knew how to go to prophecies in Scripture. That's what a lot of believers in Jesus are trained in doing. But I really didn't know how to do much beyond that. And so the book came about because I was looking for ways to actually respond to the heavy philosophical objections that I was receiving. And the book is a trek through medieval Jewish thought and how it came to be in Judaism that the idea of a man being God was totally non-kosher. It wasn't always that way, but it became that way. And so the book is a thorough defense of Yeshua, Jesus' deity, but while in constant conversation with the medieval Jewish tradition and also contemporary Jewish scholarship.
So you mentioned that this book really came out of having those conversations with Jewish people and these philosophical topics that seemed you saying you were ill-equipped to handle at the time. So can you point us to a conversation that was really impactful for you when it comes to kind of the sparks of this book?
Several of my conversations out on the streets of Brooklyn were impactful in that I felt like we went nowhere and we were talking past each other, and I didn't even understand like what the conversation even was about. Mm-hmm. I would ask a yes or no question and they would respond with a story that somehow they seemed to think answered my question, but I just thought it didn't. Thought that they were changing the subject, but obviously they didn't think so. And so I walked away really confused. But there was one other time that was actually with you guys. You guys were in the same room when we were talking with a ultra-Orthodox Hasidic man. And he said things like, I'm not a Platonist and I don't believe that God has properties. And I thought to myself, well, one, what's a Platonist? And two, well, you don't believe that God has properties? Well, what about the great and awesome and mighty God and, the God of full of loving kindness towards Israel and the covenant making God? Aren't those scriptural properties? And so I was totally ill-equipped to respond to him. And you guys were there with me. We were just kind of flabbergasted. Like, how do we respond to this? And then I just came to realize how ignorant I was, that is a pretty standard position in Orthodox Judaism. And I was just totally unaware of that. I was really a fish out of water.
Yeah, I was not anticipating the topic of Platonism to come up when we walked into his house.
For sure. So other books have been written on the Incarnation, but what makes your book stand apart from those apologetics books addressing these kinds of Jewish objections?
There's a lot of books out there about the deity of Jesus. Most of them are written in a Gentile context for Gentiles to consider the identity of Jesus. And some of them deal with Jewish things, but oftentimes they deal with, say, Second Temple Judaism. They deal with how the claims of Jesus in the first century, they were part and parcel of a Jewish worldview 2,000 years ago. But I found in my research and my study and trying to figure out how to deal with the things I was hearing in Brooklyn, that very few books are out there and available that are dealing with the present day objections that many Jewish people have about Jesus' deity. And so there was this 2,000 year gap, and I'm like, well, Judaism isn't the same as it was back in the first century. Like, there have been real changes. And so I wrote the book because I couldn't find anybody else who had written a book that deals really with the major objections that come from, one, Maimonides, and two, from the Kabbalistic tradition, which is that they really do provide the major intellectual heavyweight ideas that Jesus' deity is either impossible or just totally redundant. The book tries to fill that gap, recognizing that there are no Jewish people alive today who hold to Second Temple Judaism. So just writing a book defending Jesus' deity with that Judaism in mind, it doesn't go anywhere today. And I want to actually be able to share about Yeshua's deity with Jewish people who are alive and breathing and thinking through these issues today.
I think you did a great job filling that gap. I have not seen any other book like this on this topic, so it's a really great contribution. And so let's dig a little bit into the book itself. What is the broad outline of the book? What does it cover kind of in broad strokes?
Sure. So after an introductory chapter where I kind of deal with some of the ground rules for how I'm going to be treating the issues and defining terms, talking about how Judaism has changed over time in certain theological positions, then I just dive into the Tanakh and I ask, what does the Tanakh actually teach about who and what God is? And actually ask the question, what is the nature of God? And then I pause and I say, well, actually, you can't answer that question based off of the resources of the Tanakh itself, because the word nature doesn't show up in the Tanakh. Like, that's a Greek philosophical word that is so common for us today, but that's a topic that doesn't show up in the Tanakh. So I try to keep out later philosophical and theological jargon and ideas, whether from the New Testament or from the Mishnah or the Gemara or from Maimonides or Kabbalah, and just look at what is the Tanakh actually saying. And I find that there's a lot of tensions in the Tanakh. Is God everywhere or nowhere? Is he incomparable? There's nothing that is like him? Well, but it says that we're made in the image and likeness of God. It uses the word likeness in the Hebrew. So what does it mean that God is incomparable, but also we're like him? That those seem to be in tension with each other. So I just kind of lay out the ground rules, and then I explain how there have been different Jewish groups that have answered those tensions in different ways over time. And some of those early answers came from Philo and the rabbinic sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and they had different ways of dealing with these issues. But then I transitioned to say, but nobody really follows what Philo and even the early rabbinic sages say about the nature of God anymore. Basically, once Maimonides came onto the scene, he changed everything when it came to understanding the God of Israel. And then Kabbalah comes a century later and reinterprets Maimonides. And so I spend the first 2/3 of the book explaining these different Jewish attempts to deal with the nature of God, do a really in-depth analysis of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed and his third principle of his 13 principles. And then I look at the Kabbalistic tradition and kind of do a systematic theology of what Kabbalah teaches about God. And then I analyze them from a modern philosophical and scientific perspective to try to find where do they actually hold water and where do they have major problems. And I never talk about the New Testament during that whole time. I just strategically keep it all out. And then once I have analyzed and critiqued Maimonides and Kabbalah and shown that they really don't really provide the kind of coherent answers to these questions that we should want in the 21st century. That kind of clears the ground for a new option to come to the table. And that new option in the final third of the book is the New Testament. Because the New Testament, it provides a different Jewish theological model that affirms that God has come in flesh as a man named Yeshua of Nazareth. And so the final third of the book is finally when I get around to explaining the New Testament's position on these things and then defending it in light of Maimonides and Kabbalah. I always have them in conversation with each other. I don't let them get very far away from each other at any point in the book.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated about the approach that you took in the book is this is not purely apologetics or argumentation. You also do a really thorough job of laying out the historical development of these different theologies. And it was just fascinating, and I learned a lot on top of understanding how they all engage with one another. So I thought that was a really great feature of the book.
Absolutely. And I really want to, I'm thinking to our viewers who are just have the Shema in mind when you just bring up the idea of the incarnation, and just what would make someone want to read your book, given that we do in the Jewish community have the Shema, that hear Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So even considering your argument for the incarnation, why take that even seriously?
Yeah, that is a really good question, because oftentimes the Shema is seen as a game stopper
Right.
for the common New Testament-based beliefs in the triunity of God, that God is three and one in different aspects, but then also that the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, actually took on flesh. And many Jewish people just assume, well, that goes against the Shema. How can you Christians and Messianic Jews say that you believe in the Shema if you also hold these beliefs? It just doesn't make sense. So I deal with the logic of that all throughout my final third of the book. And so I would encourage my readers to actually dive in there. But let's just say that the reading of the Shema that makes the Trinity and the Incarnation impossible, that is a later development in Jewish theology. Okay, so I have a book over here. It's by Louis Jacobs. He was a British rabbi, and he wrote on Maimonides' 13 Principles. And in his look through on the second principle on the oneness of God, he goes through some 30 different rabbinic Jewish understandings of the Shema, 30 of them. There's no one answer to what the word echad means in the Shema. There's a whole bunch of different answers. Yet to say that word definitely means that God cannot have three persons in his oneness, that there can't be a unity of three persons, that monotheism doesn't allow for three persons within that unity, that's kind of stacking the deck in a really unfair manner, because there's been so many different debates within the Jewish community, not even talking with Christians, about what the Shema actually means for God's unity. So I would just encourage my readers to have an open mind about that. Yes, the Shema has been used to argue against the Trinity, and I deal with that. It's been used to argue against the Incarnation. I deal with that. But I believe that there are answers within Judaism that can give a plausible response to that.
When I hear incarnation, the idea that Jesus is God, right? Just to put it simply, and you're dealing with Kabbalah, you're dealing with Maimonidean worldview. Is the conclusion that you come to in the book something different than you could say Orthodox Christianity? Are you articulating the incarnation or Trinity differently? Or how are you articulating it so we can understand more where you're coming from?
That's a good question. So I have to walk a tightrope in this book, because I recognize that there have been a lot of bad things that Christians have taught about Jewish people throughout the century, and not just taught, but actually affirmed in bad actions against the Jewish community for centuries. And so the idea of Christians being some kind of spiritual authority is really not kosher in the Jewish community. But on the other hand, I believe that there are some very core teachings that the Christian church has taught over the centuries that are accurately teaching what the New Testament said. And the New Testament is a group of Jewish works written by Jewish followers of Yeshua. And so if the church was actually teaching accurately what the New Testament said, then that means that the church was accurately teaching Jewish doctrines of Jesus and the apostles. So I have to walk that tightrope. And so I do bring up the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedonian definition, which are two very important creeds of the church from the 4th and 5th centuries. And I explain how while these creeds, they don't really say much about Jesus' Jewishness, they don't really say much about the Tanakh, the Old Testament, they don't really give much credence to, why is it that Jesus was Jewish, and what about the prophets, and what about Abraham? The creeds don't really mention anything about that. But what they do mention is actually accurate according to what the New Testament says. So I do spend time justifying, as you put it, Jonathan, an orthodox Christology, which is a theological term for who the person of Messiah Jesus is, who the Christ is, and that he is both 100% God and 100% man at the same time, which is on one hand a mystery, but also there's some really good philosophical and theological models that can lessen the mystery at least somewhat, so that it doesn't turn into some affirmation of a total contradiction. And so I really do embrace the weight of Maimonides' accusation that if God were to become a man, that would be an absolute contradiction. I don't just run away from that. I analyze that, I question it, and I provide ways around that to show that actually it maybe is not a contradiction. Maybe there's actually some more plausibility here than Maimonides was willing to give.
I think what you did in the book, really approaching the New Testament, as you said here, as Jewish literature and as Jewish ideas themselves, I think is really a kind of a paradigm shift in how one person, maybe a Jewish person, may approach the New Testament. So I found that to be really helpful.
Thanks so much.
Now to dig a little bit deeper into your work, how did you go about accomplishing your argument, engaging with Maimonides and with Kabbalah?
So before I set up an argument against their positions, I first wanted to actually hear what they actually have to say. And so I needed to provide their own beliefs, their own worldview from their own words without any criticism. So I have an entire chapter just devoted to Maimonides' position on incarnation, on divine embodiment. I do a very close reading of the Guide to the Perplexed. In fact, I don't know of any other Gentile Christian or Messianic Jewish author who has actually done an in-depth study of the Guide to the Perplexed like I have. So that chapter goes in depth with just what is Maimonides' position. And I do the same thing for what is Lurianic Kabbalah and what is its worldview. And, talking about Ein Sof and it shoots a light, and then there's the Simsum, and then the emergence of the Sphirot, and then we emerge from the bottom after all of that. So I go through all of those things without any critique, any appeal to any believers in Jesus during that whole time. Just let them speak. And then after I let them speak, that is when I then have chapters where I look for the holes and I look for the problems in their worldviews. And so I have two arguments that I give, one against the Maimonidean worldview and the second against the Kabbalistic worldview. And I put them in good philosophical fashion in a set of premises with a conclusion. And so the first one about Maimonides, I've got several premises, so 6 premises and then a final 7th conclusion. So the first one, number 1, Maimonides teaches that divine embodiment is impossible. Number 2, Maimonides supports his belief in the impossibility of divine embodiment from 4 directions: his cosmology, his a priori reasoning, his comprehensive negative theology, and his hermeneutics, or the way that he interprets Scripture. So I explain those 2 points in the chapter where I offer zero criticism. Then points 3 through 6, that's when I actually provide counterpoints. So, number 3, counterpoint. Maimonides' cosmology is false. Number 4, counterpoint. Maimonides' a priori reasoning is false. Number 5, counterpoint. Maimonides' comprehensive negative theology, or via negativa, is false. Number 6, counterpoint. Maimonides' hermeneutics about God talk are false. God talk is the term that we use when Scripture talks about God, describes God using words, phrases, descriptions. I believe that Maimonides' hermeneutics of those passages is false. And then number 7, therefore, Maimonides' rejection of divine embodiment lacks rational basis. And then I say, well, if points 3 through 6 are all true, meaning that Maimonides is false in those areas, then we should relook at Maimonides as a spiritual authority on the matters of divine embodiment. But then I say, well, maybe I can hedge my bets here. Maybe if only one of my 4 counterpoints are actually accurate, should we still relook at Maimonides? Yeah, I think so. Because even one of those 4 still creates major problems for Maimonides' worldview. So I have a discussion about each of those counterpoints with Maimonides. And then I did the same thing with the Kabbalistic position. And I also have 7 points for my Kabbalistic argument. So number 1, Kabbalah affirms panentheism such that the universe is God incarnate. So everything in the universe is in God. We all have divine sparks within us. Some of us are more divine than others, but everything is God. Ein od milvado is the common phrase that is used. Number 2, Kabbalah grounds its panentheism in its doctrines of cosmology, metaphysics, and hermeneutics. Number 3, counterpoint. Key aspects of Kabbalah's cosmology are false. Number 4, counterpoint. Key aspects of Kabbalah's metaphysics are false. Number 5, counterpoint. Key aspects of Kabbalah's hermeneutics are false. Number 6, counterpoint. Kabbalah's epistemic authority is historically dubious. In other words, its claim to being a very old tradition is not justifiable. Finally, number 7, therefore, Kabbalah's panentheism is false. So those are the 2 major arguments that I work through. And again, I don't appeal to anything Christian, Messianic Jewish, Jesus, anything as I am making those arguments. It is only after I've cleared the room, so to speak, of these 2 worldviews, positions on who God is, that I then introduce the New Testament as a better option than either of these.
Thank you for laying that out so clearly to see how your argument unfolds and your thought process in addressing both of these worldviews. I'm curious, have you received any feedback from Orthodox Jewish readers? Even if they disagree with your ultimate conclusions, how did they think you did when it came to giving a general assessment of what Maimonides taught or what Kabbalah taught?
Yeah, all of this is a waste of time if I'm making arguments based off of straw man arguments. If I am totally misrepresenting Maimonides, totally misrepresenting Kabbalah, if I'm totally off target, then I'm making arguments against nothing. I'm against the air. And so that was my biggest fear and also my greatest obsession in writing this book, that I wanted to make sure that I actually was portraying Maimonides and Kabbalah accurately to the satisfaction of people who follow Maimonides and follow Kabbalah. And so, yeah, thankfully, I have had several Orthodox Jewish people who I've been able to interact with on a deep level about the book. And they say that I have succeeded in that goal. I'm very thankful for that. Again, it was a big risk. I'm not Jewish. I'm a Gentile Christian. This is not my tradition. So I don't have this natural affinity to be able to explain this accurately. I had to learn and I had to study a ton. So I'm very thankful that they say that I am treating their tradition accurately and fairly and respectfully. That was my goal as well. And then, yeah, they've said I've given them a lot of things to think about. That there are some of them have said, yeah, we need some time to actually study these things more, because you're bringing up things that we have never thought about, that nobody in our community thinks about, and yet there's some real substance here to your critiques, and we need to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to respond to you. So, hey, I'll take that. Of course, I would love anybody who reads the book to get to the last third of the book and see that, well, believing in Yeshua and his deity is actually a very Jewish thing to do. But until they get to that point, hey, I'll take, yeah, you handled Maimonides and Kabbalah well, and you've given us some things to think about.
That's really encouraging to hear that. And I just also want to ask, so you mentioned when I asked about like what makes this book unique among other books that I've written, and you said, of course, and I know you, Brian, you're a Gentile Christian. So why did you write this in the first place?
What makes this book different from all other books? Yes. Why did I write this?
And who did you write it? And who did you write it for? Also, I want to ask.
Yeah, I wrote this because I saw a real need to answer some of the biggest heavyweight philosophical and theological objections that were coming against Yeshua's deity from some of the most brilliant Jewish people who have ever lived. And I respect Maimonides and his brilliance. I respect the Kabbalistic tradition and how much it brings a sense of awe, wonder, meaning, and purpose to so many Jewish people. I respect these traditions while deeply disagreeing with many of the things that they teach. And so I wanted to be able to enter into those worldviews and yet find ways to climb out of them, so to speak, to find ways to show that Yeshua truly is the Messiah of Israel and God in the flesh. So who is this book for? This book is for anybody who wants to go deep into the theology and the philosophy of both the Jewish and the Christian traditions, and wants to bridge the gap. I interact with Messianic Jewish scholars as well, and so that all of us are in this mix. This is one big long conversation that our communities have been having, but it hasn't really been written down in books that much. We're kind of been siloed talking about these things, and so my book brings the conversation together. And so anybody who is interested in what Maimonides says, what Kabbalah says, what the Orthodox Christian position has said about who Jesus is, and how to have a three-way conversation amongst those groups, you're going to be interested in this. If you love philosophy, if you love theology, if you want to learn how to share the good news of Jesus with Jewish people, and yet you just totally get tongue-tied when somebody says it's impossible for God to become a man, this book is written for you.
So thank you so much again, Brian, for your hard work in writing this great book. Again, there's a link in the description to get a copy of The Scandal of a Divine Messiah for yourself and for a friend. We highly, highly recommend it. And if you enjoy this topic, please click the subscribe button to receive updates for future content. To learn more here at Chosen People Answers, we'll be going much more in depth into the worldviews of Maimonides and Kabbalah in the future. See you guys next time.